Hi, welcome to Speaking of Mysteries. My name is Bruce Southworth. I'm the mystery reviewer for the Minneapolis Star-Tribune. My guest today is Peter Lovesey, the author of 3 series. The Sergeant Cribb series, which is set in the Victorian era, began in 1970. The Bertie series, featuring who would become King Edward VII, which he began in the 1980s, around 1987. Excuse me. And Peter Diamond, started in 1991, and we're here to talk about the newest book in that series. Peter is a very award-winning novelist. Recently he was awarded the Diamond Dagger Award from the Crime Writers Association for Lifetime Achievement. He's won 3 Silver Daggers and 1 Gold Dagger from that organization. And in France, his awards include the, I hope I'm doing this right, Grand Prix de Littérature Policière. It's one of the highest awards for crime fiction in France. I really appreciate your being here. Thank you very, very much.
It's a great pleasure to come.
Let's start, perhaps, if you wouldn't mind, giving us just kind of a brief description of the new book, Diamond Dust.
Yes, it's number 7, really, in a series of books featuring this character, Peter Diamond, who is a detective who lives and works in the city of Bath, which is not renowned for its crime rate, but he manages to find murders to investigate, and he's I suppose a little bit at odds with his superiors and with the whole police atmosphere. He tends to sort of go his own way and do his own thing, but I think you need that really for a detective who readers are going to identify with, and who is going to do something which basically is rather unrealistic in being the centre of a crime investigation for the whole of the length of a book. I felt as I was writing the series, which was going, reasonably well, that it was getting just a little too cosy and predictable for me. And I felt that he needed some kind of big challenge in his life, something that would alter him as a personality, and something that he would have to cope with and come to terms with. And that really was the basis of this particular book.
Well, perhaps we can have you read just a short section, which I think will give the viewers a real sense of that challenge that he's going to have to face, if you wouldn't mind.
Yes, okay. It just happens that I have my book with me.
Very handy. And open to the right page.
Okay. The Royal Victoria Park, on sloping ground to the west of the city, is in effect 2 parks. One rather gracious, with lawns descending to a wooded area, providing the Royal Crescent with its leafy view, and the other, larger and containing the Botanic Gardens, a fish pond, and a children's playground overlooking the gasworks. They are bisected by Marlborough Buildings and its long gardens. The shooting had happened in the gracious part, near the bandstand, on the south fringe of the park, below the crescent. They had sealed off the scene with police tape. The inevitable gawpers had gathered at the margin, but helpfully the trees screened the place from the car park. The scene of crime lads, with at least one lass, in their white zipper overalls, were already at work. Halliwell was standing with the constable guarding the access path. Spotting Diamond, he came over to meet him, rubbing his hands. "We're back in business, Gov." "What do we know?" "Middle-aged woman, shot twice in the head at close range. No sign of the weapon, apart from 2 holes in her head." Halliwell grinned. "Well, I guess that counts as a sign." "Let's have a look, then." Halliwell led the way to where the scene of crime officers were combing the ground for traces of the crime. The corpse was covered with a white plastic sheet. "Who found her?" Diamond asked. "Mr. Warburton, walking his dog, about 10:20 this morning. He heard the shots and came over." "Did he see the killer?" "No, too far away. He was up the hill, not far from the crescent. When he got here there was just the woman, lying dead." "Other people must have heard it, well into the morning. People are about. The car park would have been filling up." "Yes, but he was the only one who bothered to check." Diamond didn't question this. The common reaction to the sound of shooting isn't to go and investigate. Most people dismiss it as a car backfiring. If they know it's a gun, they head in the opposite direction. He stood over the covered corpse. "What am I waiting for? Someone to introduce us?" Halliwell stooped and lifted the sheet from the head. Diamond ran an experienced glance over the blanched face, one blood-red hole almost exactly in the centre of the forehead, and another in front of the left ear. Then he stared. His skin prickled, and his muscles went rigid, as if volts were passing through them. From deep in his throat came a sound more like a vomit than distress. He sank to his knees and snatched back the plastic sheet and looked at the woman's clothes. No question. She was wearing the black Burberry raincoat she'd bought from Jolly's last summer, and the blue silk square he'd given her on her last birthday. He fingered a strand of her hair, and it felt like straw. "It's Steph," he said, gagging on the words. "The bastards have shot my wife."
If that's not going to give him a challenge, I don't know what
Oh,
will.
well.
It's just having read some of the other books, of course, that really, hit me in that. Even having a hint of what was going to happen. So, I'm curious. Other than the sort of the natural shock that he's in, did you have a sense of kind of the way you wanted this novel to be viewed? In some ways, it's the man trying to cope and to function after a big shock, and in other ways, it could be kind of focused on the man of action who's locked out of the action.
Yes, I suppose it could. Yes, obviously, the premise of the book is now that he has to go forward and find the killers. But he's a rebel as well, as I mentioned just now, and he's going to have to become even more of a rebel because you can't really have the policeman investigating the death of his own wife. Immediately, his boss comes in and tells him to keep off. Somebody else will come in and do this investigation. But Diamond isn't the kind of man who's going to allow some other character to investigate his wife's death. He's going to want to be involved and do things for himself. So there's that part of his character and personality.
Mm-hmm.
There's the part of him that is trying to cope at home. The silence of the home.
Mm-hmm.
All of that is obviously something he's got to come to terms with. So that he's really under tremendous stress. It's not perhaps quite such a humorous book as some of the others have been.
Mm-hmm.
A darker book, maybe. Well, I mean, I think there are elements of humour in it, but this is really, say, a life challenge for him.
Yeah, definitely a darker book. I was kind of intrigued because he turns away, or just refuses necessarily any gifts of comfort or people who want to come around, friends and all that sort of thing. But I was wondering if there was any significance in the fact that really the only two people that he talks to for guidance or for comfort are people who are distant from him in a way. The woman that he used to work with, they talk strictly over the phone and she's a distance away, and a friend of his from his London police days, physically closer, but again, the time is the connection between the two.
Yes, I think there's certainly something in that. I think that is a point that I hadn't thought too much about, but it's quite true. The people close to him, his present close colleagues, are somehow too near to it all, and in a way he's forced into this position because he's doing something which is not strictly within the rules and conventions of the police. He's trying to find things out, and he's got to have people he really trusts. And Julie Hargreaves, who is the old colleague you mentioned, was the person he trusted most. Mm-hmm. But even she, because he's such a sort of difficult, cantankerous old character, even she couldn't stand it in the end and asked for a transfer. Mm. But he respected her, and she was the colleague he thought was the most help, and he would love to have her back. But
yeah, there seemed to be a warm connection between them, from the conversations they had back and forth on the phone. Mm. So, could you tell me a little bit about how you kind of developed the character of Peter Diamond from the beginning, and perhaps how you've seen him change over the course of the 7 books?
Yeah, he came in when I first described him in the first book in the series. It was called The Last Detective. I described him first. He was lying on a trolley, a gurney, you call it, I think, just outside the dissecting room in the mortuary, and you think, well, maybe there's another corpse here, but it isn't. He's fully dressed, but he's lying there, and I describe him as when he gets up as like a sort of dinosaur rising from a medieval swamp, because he's got quite a corporation as well. But that's deliberate. He is a bit of a dinosaur. He's a man who has a great respect for the detectives of the 1940s, and he even wears a trilby hat and fawn raincoat in those early books, and has a great admiration for non-fiction books written by detectives of the 40s and 50s, sort of Fabian of the Yard and that kind of series of books. So he's like that. He's a bit at odds with the current policeman, really as a defensive thing for me, because when I started this contemporary series, it was a big change for me. I've been writing books which were set either in Victorian times or in slightly more recent times, but they were all in period, you could say. This was a contemporary series, and I was a little scared of all that forensic stuff, the the DNA analysis and genetic fingerprinting and the modern forensic method. I thought, not only how can I get to know about it, but also how can I make it interesting to my readers? Do I have to explain the intricacies of these things to make sense of them? So that was a challenge, and I thought, well, the way through is to have old Diamond as a man who despises the men in white coats, and only uses them as a desperate measure.
There's a quote by you, actually, that kind of goes to that. I don't remember where I grabbed this from. I think it was from might have been a Publishers Weekly or something like that. You had said, you were looking for a realistic Victorian detective. Now this is starting out describing the Sergeant Cribb. You're conscious that the great detectives were super figures. I wanted somebody who would have to struggle to solve a crime and to have to work against the limitations of the period. And when I found that, I started to think that Diamond isn't so much functioning against the limitations of the period. He seems to be functioning against the progress of the period. His reluctance to use computers, and as you say, the DNA evidence is kind of a big challenge for him.
Yes,
So,
that's very true. He is distinctly different from Sergeant Cribb, my earlier creation, but for a number of reasons that maybe we could go into later. But I think that's a very good point.
Going back to some of the other novels, particularly I was thinking about The False Inspector Dew that was published in 1982. One critic described the technique of doubling in the series, where there were a false Inspector Dew and a real Inspector Dew, and this revolved in a way around the Dr. Crippen case, who fled England to avoid arrest. And in this book there was obviously the real Crippen and the false Crippen and sort of thing.
Yes.
It struck me that in this latest book, there are elements of that doubling as well. There's 2 murders, 2 investigators, 2 confidants. Is that something you might be doing unconsciously, or do you purposely think about that?
It was very conscious in the first book you mentioned, The False Inspector Dew, because I'd read the memoirs of the detective who investigated the Crippen case, which is a very, very famous case in Britain. I don't know how well known it is here. And in that he writes about Dr. Crippen, this American who committed the murder of his wife in England, in a way that is almost affectionate, and he talks about him as the little fellow and my friend Crippen and so on. And it struck me that there's a kind of sort of ambivalence. He was almost identifying himself. He's the detective, but he's identifying himself with the killer, getting into the mind of the killer, and he feels some sympathy, I think, for Crippen, who had this almost monstrous wife who was a sort of musical star and was doing all sorts of things that made Crippen's own life rather difficult, inviting her friends around for music hall evenings and so on. She was a very over-the-top character. So that was when I set out to write The False Inspector Dew. I certainly wanted to get that that double thing there, the ambivalence. I haven't gone about it consciously in Diamond Dust, but now you make the point. I suppose it could be an element that comes through. I am quite interested in the in the psychology of the criminal and the detective, and the fact that they're not always so divided. Sometimes they have a lot of things in common.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's I can't go into it here. It would give too much away. But the second murder that occurs in the book is similar to the murder of Diamond's wife.
Yes.
And Diamond and I've forgotten the inspector's name, the detective who's investigating.
Begins with a W, and I can't remember it.
Okay.
I'll have to look it up. But yeah,
the other fellow anyway. I mean, they're both very competent.
Stormy weather, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So it's kind of interesting that sort of duality going on. Let's go back a little bit to your own background. Now, you've been a teacher. You headed the educational department of a university, and then you moved into writing about sports. You've written 3 nonfiction books about sports, and then after that, shifting into mysteries. And I was wondering if you could kind of describe how you moved from one thing to another. It seems like an interesting path.
Yes, the sports really came first in my life while I was at school, not because I was good at sports, but because I was hopeless at sports. I was the kid who just sort of couldn't catch a ball or run very fast without sort of getting a pain. And the only way to keep up with the other boys at school who were good at sports and sort of kept, had a big interest in them was to know a lot about it. So I became a kind of track nut in particular. I knew a lot about running and sports generally, and could talk about famous champions of this and that as much as I liked. And gradually that got to the point later on where I began to write things because of my knowledge of sports, and began to do some journalism in a small way, and ultimately wrote a book on long distance running called The Kings of Distance, which was the very first thing I ever did back in 1968. That came out and sold about 2,000 copies, I think. But it encouraged me, it made me think, well, I can finish a book. And then the transition to the mystery writing was that there was an advert in the Times newspaper in London. First crime novel competition, cash prizes offered. You see, write for particulars. And my wife said to me, well, have you ever thought of writing a mystery? I said, well, no, I don't think I've ever read any except one Agatha Christie and the Sherlock Holmes stories I've read and enjoyed. So she said, why didn't you send away for the particulars? And at that time I was earning about £900 a year in my teaching job. And they came out. I still have them, the thing with me that came back from, because it was important in my life, and this was it. So you see, £1,000, £1,000. First crime. You won't be able to read the small print, but I didn't bother either. So there it was. I decided to use the sports background as the basis of the first book in this, what was to become a series. And I used a long distance race, which went on for 6 days in Victorian times at the Agricultural Hall, Islington, and that was the background for the whole story. And the races were known as wobbles because of the state of the runners as they went round and round and round this small track for days on end.
I was wondering about that.
And it'd be called Wobble to Death, and I sent it off. It was all done in 3 months, and I was lucky enough to win. So that was the beginning. And after that, I was a mystery writer. When I went up to collect the cheque, the publisher said, "Well, what about number 2? Have you thought?" Oh dear, I hadn't thought about that. So I quickly concocted a plot about another sport, boxing, bare knuckle boxing, and that was the beginning of a series.
It would have been kind of an auspicious beginning. You've been described by critics, quoting a couple things here, as the reigning master of the historical novel. That was in the New York Times Book Review. Your books have been praised for factual accuracy, meticulous research. And certainly in the Victorian, all of the elements, everything that I've read, it comes to life. I was curious how you go about. Well, first, how do you plan out a novel? Say you're going to write a novel. What comes first? The sense of setting, the idea of the plot, and then how do you move into the research from there?
Yeah, it was certainly in that first series of Victorian stories. It was very much getting a setting or a theme. Each of the books was really some kind of entertainment. I mean, obviously I started with sports. I thought I could do my running one, I could do my boxing one, and then I turned to the music hall and sort of vaudeville, and then I moved on to other sort of forms of Victorian entertainment, spiritualism, and there was one on the Waxworks Museum and the excitement about that. So that was the background. And once I decided on that as being the main theme of the book, then I had to decide how murders would fit in, and I began to concoct the plot. I always work the plots out ahead of writing the book. I'm a slow writer, so I find that I can't afford to waste words, so I might as well get the story plotted with its surprises and write a synopsis for myself. And that's always been my method over the years.
You've used a lot of interesting techniques in your books as well, though. In one book, there was a very slow sort of build-up to the first murder that occurs in the book, and the detectives don't appear on the scene until well into the book. You change point of view quite a bit, not only from perhaps the so-called main character, but some of the side characters or second characters or something like that. That must be very interesting to do. How do you, in your mind, change voice and change point of view to make it work?
Well, it's sort of slow process, writing a book, that to keep the interest going, and obviously you've got to be interested and excited about it, or your readers never will. I think it's good that the book shouldn't just sort of fit into a form. That you should be looking for new ways of doing it all the time. That's been my own way of keeping up the pace. I mean, one of the stories in that first series, I thought, well, I'll try and write a sort of almost a James Bond type story. And I analysed the book Goldfinger very carefully, and how he went about it and the various scenes in it, and thought, well, I wonder if I could, using basically Fleming's plot, whether I could write a Victorian Goldfinger. So that I was doing things like that, yes, and changing the point of view and so on. But that for me keeps me sane. I really would find that if I was just writing the same kind of book each time, I would find that rather boring, and I don't think I'd have carried on as a writer if I'd felt like that.
It sounds like that also may be in a way to keep a series fresh as you're going along by changing your point of view. Kind of just taking a different look from different sides. You leave the main character out in a way.
Yes.
And that way he or she doesn't get too particularly, stale is the only word I can think of.
Yes, no, right. That's right. You've got it. You've summed it up nicely.
You've also had a lot of very strong female characters in your books. I mean, right from the beginning. They were either rather virtuous or cruel seductress and so on. And I found that kind of interesting. It was kind of back in the time, when the women's movement was really kind of pushing, maybe just a bit later. And I was wondering if that was a reaction to that, or if that was just that you needed that character there at the time, and so it had to come to be. Yeah.
Well, I suppose if they are, women. I've probably met a number of women I would like to put into books over the years, and that's it. Something that you do regardless of which particular period you're in. I like to write about women, and I think they should feature largely in the books. And I'm sorry that I killed Diamond's wife. Really, she was a wonderful character. But there we are. I mean, as I was saying just now, you have to sort of present yourself with new challenges, and the killing of Steph was one of them. But yes, the short answer to the question that you were giving me is that I do like to have strong women in the books. Yes, I feel that that's quite necessary.
I need to change directions here. We're kind of running a bit out of time, but one of the books that was in the Sergeant Cribb series called Swing, Swing Together, you modeled after Jerome K. Jerome's Three Men in a Boat, to say nothing of the dog. And I love the book, and I was wondering how that idea came about to sort of track it along the same line.
Yeah, I did discover that after his book was an enormous bestseller, and I did discover reading, I forget whether it was reading a biography of Jerome or something else, that it did become the fashion for people afterwards to do the trip, to get in a boat and row along the Thames and enjoy themselves at leisure. And I thought, well, yeah, it would be fun to write something which was not quite a pastiche of his book, but something which was recreating the trip place by place, but with a body thrown in. so that made it, it gave me something else to try, and yet when I wrote the book, I almost wrote it in the Jerome K. Jerome manner, with little bits at the beginning of each chapter, summarising what was in the chapter in an amusing way, which is exactly what happened in the original book.
Yeah, and I think you even had the same number of chapters or something
Probably,
like that. It was,
probably,
it was very, very well outlined. I thought that was terrific. Jerome's book, I think it's just been absolutely great. We appear to have kind of run out of our time, unfortunately. There's much more I'd like to talk about, but we'll just have to do this another time, I guess.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for being here. I appreciate it.
Thank you. I thoroughly enjoyed it.